Her daughter-in-law laughed and said, "This room is mine now." Eleanor Whitman, widow and rightful owner of the Whitman Estate, didn't argue. Madison filled the suite with chandeliers, champagne, and cameras, ready to show off her new home. By morning, every guest would see the brass nameplate above that same door. It didn't read Madison Whitman, owner. It read Eleanor M. Whitman, owner, Whitman Estate. And in one quiet moment, the house remembered who it truly belonged to. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Madison's laughter echoed across the hall. "This room is mine now." Her voice carried like perfume, sweet but stinging, and it took everything in me not to flinch. The movers shuffled behind her, balancing boxes labeled Master Suite Madison. One of them brushed past the oak doorframe my husband had carved by hand 40 years ago. I wanted to tell them to be careful, but the words stuck somewhere between pride and heartbreak. Luke lingered near the doorway, head bowed, his tie loosened. "It's just temporary, Mom," he murmured. "Of course," I said. My tone came out so calm it startled even me. Temporary. Such a tender word for theft. Madison tossed her designer tote onto my dresser, its brass corners clinking against the wood. "You won't need this space anymore," she said lightly, flipping her hair over one shoulder. She was beautiful in that curated way some women manage, every strand intentional, every glance practiced for an audience that never stopped watching. I traced the window frame with my fingertip. "You're right," I said softly. "I won't." She smiled, triumphant, assuming the conversation had ended, but it hadn't. It had only just begun. From the hallway, sunlight spilled across the rug, the same one Richard and I had picked out in Savannah after his first judgeship. It felt smaller now, as if the house itself were holding its breath. When the movers left, I walked to the armoire. Madison was already on her phone, purring into it. "Yes, the suite is ours now. It's going to look incredible." The plural word, ours, hung in the air like cigarette smoke. I closed the armoire door carefully. "Do let me know if you find the old deed papers in there," I said. "They might still be tucked inside the bottom drawer." She laughed. "Oh, I'm sure none of that matters anymore." Downstairs, Annie was waiting in the parlor, half hidden behind the morning paper. "Well," she said when she saw my face, "the coup has begun." "Quietly executed," I replied, easing into the chair beside her. My hands still smelled faintly of cedar from the dresser. "She's bold," Annie said. "I'll give her that." "She's young," I corrected. "Boldness is just inexperience wearing high heels." Annie folded the paper, eyeing me. "You're plotting something, aren't you?" I smiled faintly. "No, Annie. I'm just remembering what's written in the deed." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence only long friendships can hold. Outside, the magnolias trembled in the wind, their petals soft but stubborn. Annie reached for her teacup. "You could tell her now," she whispered. "End it before it begins." "Timing," I said. "Richard used to say, the law means nothing without timing." She tilted her head. "You always were the patient one." "I married a judge," I reminded her. "Patience was part of the vows." Later that afternoon, I went upstairs to pack. Madison had left her perfume lingering in the air. Something expensive and sweet, completely wrong for this room. I folded my dresses one by one, each motion steady, deliberate. My wedding gown still hung in its linen sheath, yellowed a little at the hem. I touched the lace and whispered, "Don't worry, we built this right." Luke appeared in the doorway again, guilt softening his voice. "Mom, Madison didn't mean to upset you." "She didn't," I said. "She just reminded me what matters." He hesitated. Maybe it's good for everyone. A fresh start. Fresh starts, I said, usually come after something dies. He didn't reply. He just nodded, the way he used to when he was a boy caught between truth and obedience. Then he left, and I finished folding the last of my things. At dusk, I carried a small box of belongings down the hall to the guest wing. The air there was cooler, quieter, almost forgotten. I placed my photographs on the small writing desk, one by one. Richard in his chambers, Luke as a toddler in the garden, Chloe holding her first seashell. Every image was a reminder of what permanence looked like. Through the open window, I could hear Madison laughing again, bright, careless, victorious. I closed the curtains gently and said to no one in particular, "Enjoy the view while it lasts." The house creaked in reply, old wood shifting under the weight of change. Somewhere deep in its bones, it knew what I knew. This wasn't surrender. It was rearrangement. And when the night finally settled over the estate, I unlocked the drawer of the guest desk and pulled out a yellowed envelope stamped with my late husband's seal. My fingers hovered above it. Then I let it rest again. Not yet. Timing, Richard always said. Timing is everything. By morning, the house had taken on a strange new rhythm, Madison's rhythm. Doors opened wider, music played earlier, laughter lingered longer than the truth ever could. From the guest wing, I could hear her heels clicking down the hall, marking territory like a metronome of entitlement. I folded another blouse into the cedar trunk and paused at the mirror. The reflection looking back wasn't defeated, only quieter, like the tide pulling back before it returns stronger. Grace, my mother used to say, is just dignity wearing its Sunday best. By noon, Madison's voice floated up the staircase. Remember everyone, 12 sharp for brunch. The reopening of our master suite deserves champagne. She stretched that word, our, like elastic, daring it to snap. When I stepped into the hallway, Luke was helping the caterers carry floral arrangements toward the dining room. He looked relieved to see me dressed neatly, pearls fastened, smile polite. "You don't have to help," he said. "I'm not helping," I replied. "I'm hosting. In my home." He winced but said nothing. Downstairs, the brunch shimmered with performance. Crystal flutes, blush roses, an air of wealth curated for photographs rather than comfort. Madison had even hired a photographer, content for her lifestyle blog, she called it. I watched her pose near the grand staircase, head tilted just so, the kind of smile that sells everything except sincerity. "Mrs. Whitman," one of her friends chirped, "you must be so proud of how your daughter-in-law has brightened up the house." "Indeed," I said, pouring tea into her cup. "She's certainly brought light to places that didn't need it." The woman laughed politely, unsure whether she'd been complimented or cautioned. Madison didn't notice. She was too busy giving the photographer her best angles inside what used to be my room. I could almost hear the caption forming in her mind, "New beginnings in the Whitman Estate." Annie slipped in through the side entrance, always allergic to spectacle. She caught my eye from across the room, her smile thin but knowing. Later, while the guests admired Madison's taste, Annie drifted toward me at the tea table. "You could crush her with one sentence," she murmured. I refilled a sugar bowl, steady as prayer. "Revenge without timing is just noise," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You're dangerous when you start quoting your husband." "I'm disciplined," I corrected. "Danger is just discipline misunderstood." The photographer asked for a group photo, and somehow I ended up beside Madison. She slipped an arm around my shoulders for the camera. "Smile, Mother Whitman," she whispered through her teeth. "People love seeing family harmony." I turned slightly toward her, smiling with the kind of warmth only restraint can create. "Harmony always photographs well, right before the finale." The flash popped. The room applauded. Madison basked in her own spotlight. Luke clapped half-heartedly, his gaze fixed anywhere but on me. I saw the shame cross his face like a shadow when our eyes met. He excused himself soon after, muttering something about calls from work. Cowardice can look so much like busyness. When the last guest left and the caterers began packing up, I offered to help with the dishes. Madison laughed. "Oh, no need. We'll have the cleaners handle it. You should rest, Eleanor." "Thank you," I said. "I'll be sure to do that." She missed the weight of the promise beneath those words. That evening, the house was finally quiet again. The scent of champagne and roses clung to the furniture, a cheap perfume over old wood. I poured myself a small glass of sherry in the guest wing and stood by the window, looking out toward the oaks swaying in the twilight. Somewhere deep in the house, Madison's laughter flickered faintly, then faded. For the first time in days, I let the silence fill every corner. On the writing desk sat the yellowed envelope, its seal untouched. My fingers rested on it again, still not ready, but closer. I could almost hear Richard's voice in the back of my mind. "When you move, make it count." I reached for the phone instead. "Henry?" I said when the familiar gravel answered. "Ellie, it's been a while." "Yes," I said softly. "But I think it's time we open that envelope Richard left." A pause. Then, "Are you certain?" "I've never been more so." The house settled around me as I hung up, the quiet returning like loyalty. Outside, thunder murmured over the marshlands, and the first drops of rain touched the windowpane. I watched them slide down the glass. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Timing, after all, had a rhythm. And mine had just begun to play. Rain fell all through the night, a slow percussion against the old shutters. By dawn, the air smelled of wet earth and iron, like the world was rinsing itself clean. I brewed coffee strong enough to cut through the quiet and waited. Henry arrived just after 8, his umbrella dripping on the porch tiles. He'd aged into his 70s gracefully, like marble that had been handled too long to ever truly crack. "Still don't believe in sleeping in, do you?" he said, shaking the rain from his coat. "Sleep is for those without unfinished business," I replied. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. In his hand was a leather case worn at the corners, the latch tarnished with years. He carried it like a priest would a relic. "You said it was time," he reminded me. "It is." We sat in the small sitting room of the guest wing. The rest of the house was quiet. Madison and Luke had gone to some design showcase in town. Even in their absence, the air still carried her perfume, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Henry placed the case between us and opened it. Inside was the envelope. Cream paper, my husband's seal still unbroken. The wax had darkened over 10 years, but the embossed RW was unmistakable. My initials had once intertwined with his on our stationery. Now, only his remained. "Richard left this with me the day before his surgery," Henry said softly. "Told me not to deliver it unless you asked." "I remember," I murmured. "He said he didn't like goodbyes, only instructions." Henry's eyes flicked up to mine. "You sure you want to read it now?" I slid a letter opener under the seal. "Henry, I've spent a decade rehearsing patience. I think I've earned a little revelation." The paper unfolded with a sigh. Richard's handwriting stared back at me, strong, deliberate, utterly certain. My throat tightened at the first line. "If you are reading this, Ellie, then I am exactly where I'm meant to be. And so are you." He went on to outline the trust in precise legal language, but I could hear his voice in every word. The Whitman Estate, every inch, every wall, every room, was held under a living trust solely in my name. No transfer, no co-ownership, no tenant rights. The authority to manage, reclaim, or evict remained mine until the day I chose otherwise. I set the paper down slowly, letting the weight of it settle between us. Henry adjusted his glasses. "You realize what this means?" he said. "You could evict them today. No questions, no legal pushback." The temptation was sharp and fleeting, like the first sip of something forbidden. "Not yet," I said finally. He looked surprised. "You're going to let her stay?" "I'm going to let her perform," I corrected. "Let her host another event. Invite her audience. Make her declarations. She'll build her stage higher every day, and when the floor gives way, everyone will see it happen." Henry gave a low whistle. "You've always known how to play the long game." "Richard taught me," I said. "He used to say the law wasn't about punishment. It was about patience dressed as consequence." He nodded, tucking the papers back into his case. "I'll hold a copy in my office, just in case she ever tries something bold." "Oh, she will," I said, glancing toward the ceiling, where faint footsteps echoed above us. "Boldness is her native tongue." A knock sounded on the doorframe, Annie's familiar silhouette, her umbrella still damp. "I let myself in," she said, unbothered. "Didn't want to ruin your plot twist by waiting outside." Henry rose and kissed her cheek. "You two still finish each other's sentences, I see." Annie's gaze flicked to the papers in his hand. "So, the deed is done?" "In a manner of speaking," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "You're either a saint or a strategist." "Both require patience," I answered, smiling for the first time in weeks. Annie laughed softly. "Well, patience looks good on you. Dangerous, but good." I turned toward the window, watching the clouds begin to break apart, thin light stretching across the garden like a cautious promise. The rain had left everything gleaming, fresh, deceptive, ready for whatever came next. "Let her have her next party," I said quietly. "After that, I'll start mine." Henry's brow lifted. "And what kind of party will that be?" "One where the guest list writes itself," I said. He gave me a long, knowing look before heading to the door. "Then I'll bring the paperwork and the champagne." When they left, I stood alone in the quiet room, fingers tracing the edge of Richard's signature one last time. Beneath it, in his careful scrawl, he'd written a postscript I hadn't noticed before. "The law protects those who remember who they are." I smiled again, this time not for memory, but for the inevitability of what was coming. And somewhere down the hall, Madison's laughter returned faintly through the vent, high and careless as ever. I let it play, let it fill the house like smoke curling before the fire finally catches. The sound of hammers arrived before breakfast, sharp, invasive, and smug. By the third strike, I knew Madison had begun. From my window in the guest wing, I could see ladders leaned against the east facade and painters hauling cans through what used to be my bedroom window. The smell of Premier drifted down the hall. It was thick and chemical, drowning out the faint sweetness of magnolia that used to greet me each morning. Madison's voice trailed behind the commotion, commanding, delighted, expensive. "The wallpaper has to arrive before Friday. The gala committee will want photos." I walked past the open door quietly. My old room was stripped bare, the furniture covered in plastic sheets like a crime scene. Two workers were sanding the crown molding, their faces pink from the dust. One of them paused when he saw me. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, uncertain. Wasn't this your room?" I smiled faintly. "For now." He nodded slowly, unsure whether I was joking. Madison swept in a moment later, phone in hand, barking to her decorator. "No neutrals. I want French cream with undertones of gold. This isn't a museum, it's my sanctuary." She caught sight of me and gave a bright, too-wide smile. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind the noise. We're breathing new life into these walls." "They've been alive longer than you've been," I said gently. "They'll adjust." Madison laughed as though I'd complimented her. Good, because this room deserves a proper owner's touch. The word hung there. Owner, as fresh paint met old plaster. I didn't bother correcting her. Some lessons are only learned in public. By afternoon, the house looked like a showroom in progress. Rolls of imported wallpaper lay across the hall, printed with subtle fleur-de-lis patterns. Madison had chosen a chandelier so large it grazed the doorway when the delivery men carried it through. Luke hovered near the staircase, tie loosened, phone in hand. He kept trying to sound helpful, but his voice carried the strain of a man pretending not to see what was wrong. Madison thinks the redesign will increase the property's value, he told me over coffee that evening. The property's value doesn't change, I said, stirring sugar into my cup. Only its dignity. He frowned, then looked away. She's excited, Mom. Let her have her project. I met his eyes. A project ends. Possession doesn't. He didn't answer. He never did. Later, as Madison filmed a short video for her online followers, "Welcome to our Master Suite transformation," I watched from the far end of the hallway. Her voice carried through the old floorboards. She gestured toward the camera, showing off the new wallpaper and the gleaming brass door plate she'd just had installed. Madison Whitman, owner. The lettering shone under the chandelier's light, precise and vulgar at once. I felt no anger, only an odd tenderness for her ignorance. People who rename things they don't own always mistake surface for substance. I turned away before she noticed me, the faint hum of the recording still echoing in my ears. Downstairs, Annie arrived with a basket of figs and suspicion. "I saw the trucks outside," she said, handing me the basket. "Tell me you're not letting her paint over Richard's paneling." "I'm letting her do whatever she believes she has the right to," I said. "Belief is the first ingredient of downfall." Annie eyed me carefully. "You've got that look again. The one you get before you win quietly." I smiled, taking out a ledger book from the drawer beside my chair. Inside, I'd begun listing every invoice, every payment, every expense billed to the estate's joint account. Imported wallpaper, $380 custom door plate, $650 lighting installation, $200, all neatly itemized in my handwriting. When Annie leaned closer, her brows rose. "You're building a record?" "A story with receipts," I said. "Every story needs proof." She exhaled, half a laugh, half awe. "Henry's going to love this." "Henry will file it where it belongs," I replied, "under Exhibit A, Vanity in Progress." As evening fell, the workers packed up their tools. The new chandelier flickered to life, throwing a golden haze down the hallway. Madison stood beneath it, twirling in the glow, admiring her reflection in the glass panes. Luke's smile beside her looked practiced, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I watched them both for a moment. My son, my usurper, my silent audience. Then I closed my ledger and whispered to myself, "Every masterpiece needs its frame." Outside, the first autumn wind rustled through the oaks, shaking loose a few stubborn leaves. They fell quietly against the window, one after another, like gentle applause for the inevitable. And somewhere behind the new door plate, I could almost hear the echo of Richard's voice. "Remember who you are." The following morning brought a brittle quiet, the kind that follows noise pretending to be progress. The air smelled faintly of plaster dust and expensive ambition. From the guest wing, I could hear Madison upstairs directing someone about accent pillows for the shoot. She had no idea that the foundation beneath her voice was already shifting. Henry arrived just before noon, briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable. "I reviewed the trust documents again last night," he said, stepping into my sitting room. Something caught my eye. I motioned for him to sit. "You found something Richard hid, even from you?" "Not hidden," he said, loosening his tie. "Just overlooked. A clause." He opened the folder and tapped the page with his pen. Paragraph 9, Subsection B, Richard's own edition. It states that if the estate is ever used for personal profit or to promote individual gain outside the trust's purpose, legal control transfers immediately back to the trust's originator, meaning, me, I finished. He nodded. You. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, a worker's saw buzzed through the morning like a taunt. I reached for the paper, reading the precise legal phrasing. Richard's language was always exact, emotionless on the surface, but every line carried intention. Any use of the estate for self-promotion, commercial enterprise, or vanity-driven profit shall constitute misuse under the law. I couldn't help the small smile that crept across my face. He knew her before she existed. Henry chuckled quietly. The man planned for every kind of trespass. So, I said, setting the document down, all I have to do is let her brag? Exactly, he replied. The minute she publicizes this renovation as part of her business, that clause activates. Control reverts to you, instantly, automatically. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking softly beneath me. She's already posted half the remodel online. She's been tagging sponsors and lifestyle partners for weeks. She thinks she's building a brand. She's building your case, Henry said dryly, and documenting it herself. The irony was almost divine. I felt the faintest tremor of laughter rising, but it never quite reached the surface. How poetic, I murmured. She's painting her own exit one wall at a time. Henry closed his folder with a snap. I'll prepare a formal notice. You'll just need to decide when to file it. Not yet, I said, standing. She's planning another event, a weekend party for her social club. I overheard her mention it last night. Let her set the stage. Henry tilted his head, studying me. You've always had a taste for timing. Richard did, I corrected. I just learned the rhythm. When he left, the house felt almost too still, like it was waiting for its next line. I walked upstairs, pausing outside my old door. Her door now. The new nameplate gleamed in the afternoon light, arrogant and perfect. Inside, Madison was on a video call, gesturing dramatically at the gilded wallpaper. Yes, the sponsor loved the footage. They want to feature the suite in a home feature next month. Her words were music, every syllable another step closer to restoration. Downstairs, Annie had arrived unannounced, as usual, a scarf tied around her hair. She set a grocery bag on the counter. You look like a cat that swallowed something valuable. I poured her coffee. Henry found a clause. That sounds legal, she said, taking a sip. Legal means dangerous. It's protective, I said. If she uses this house for self-promotion, it reverts back to me. Annie blinked, then smiled slowly. You mean she's decorating herself into eviction? In essence. She let out a low whistle. So all you have to do is sit back and let her show off? Yes, I said, folding my arms. All I have to do is let her brag. Annie leaned against the counter, studying my face. She's digging her own hole. I looked toward the ceiling, where her laughter floated faintly through the vents, carefree, triumphant, utterly unaware. And I'm handing her the shovel. Annie grinned. You do realize that when this all comes down, people will think you planned it from the start. I didn't plan it, I said quietly. I just paid attention. Evening slipped across the windows, the light gold and thin. Madison's footsteps echoed overhead, pacing the perimeter of the room she believed she owned. Each step was a countdown. I opened my ledger again and began a new page. October 12th, sponsorship post. Our home transformation, in partnership with... The ink bled slightly where my pen pressed too hard. When I capped it, I caught my reflection in the glass of the window. Calm, steady, almost amused. The kind of look Richard used to have when a case was already won, But the verdict hadn't yet been spoken. Upstairs, the chandelier hummed as the dimmer lighted it just enough for a photograph. Madison's voice rang out bright and certain. "Perfect! The camera loves this room." And somewhere beneath her perfection, the trust clause waited. Silent, legal, absolute. 2 days after Henry's discovery, the invitations arrived, heavy cream cardstock embossed in gold foil. Madison had spared no expense. Humiliation rarely does. Each envelope was hand-delivered by a courier in a black car. The Whitman Estate was, apparently, hosting the Madison Whitman Welcome Gala. I found mine propped against the guest wing door like a notice of eviction. The handwriting on the front was neat, looping, and cruelly polite. Guest, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. Guest. I let the word sit there for a moment, as if it might correct itself. It didn't. Inside, the card shimmered with self-importance, a celebration of style, heritage, and new beginnings. It was dated for the following Saturday. Madison's social club logo was embossed discreetly in the corner, an emblem of women who mistook privilege for progress. When I brought it into the kitchen, Annie was already there, unpacking groceries and humming off key. She spotted the card and froze mid-hum. "Oh, please tell me that doesn't say what I think it says." I handed it over. She read it once, then twice, before bursting into laughter so sharp it echoed off the tiles. "Guest? In your own house?" "Apparently," I said, setting the kettle on. "It seems my presence is now ornamental." Annie wiped her eyes, still giggling. "You have to go. God, Ellie, you have to go." "Oh, I will," I said, pouring the tea, "but not as decoration." Later that afternoon, I sat at my writing desk and drafted my RSVP card. The pen moved smoothly, the way it always did when I was entirely certain. "Mrs. Eleanor M. Whitman accepts with pleasure." I sealed it with red wax and placed it in the outgoing mail pile, smiling to myself. Some performances deserve an audience. That night, the house buzzed with Madison's excitement. I overheard her instructing staff about floral arrangements, valet parking, and something about press photos on the front lawn. She moved through the halls like a debutante in her own fantasy, every command issued as if the world were her mirror. Luke trailed behind her with that familiar, practiced nod. Half support, half surrender. I didn't interrupt. I simply took note of the details: the date, the guest list, the decor budget, every penny funneled from the joint account. My ledger grew heavier by the hour. The next morning, I drove into town, past the cobblestone streets and the salt-sweet air that still carried whispers of Charleston's old charm. I parked outside Henderson and Sons Engraving, a small shop that had etched every Whitman nameplate for 3 generations. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered. The engraver, Mr. Henderson himself, white-haired, hands steady as faith, looked up from his workbench. "Mrs. Whitman, haven't seen you in quite a while. What can I do for you today?" I slid a small card across the counter. "I'd like a brass nameplate made, 6 by 2 inches, classic serif font, polished edge." He adjusted his glasses, reading the card. "Eleanor M. Whitman, owner, Whitman Estate." His eyebrows rose and a slow, knowing smile crept across his face. "That's quite a statement." "It's not a statement," I said evenly. "It's clarification." He nodded once, professional but intrigued. "Would you like it delivered?" "No," I said. "I'll collect it myself." As he began to etch the first letters, the metal hissed faintly under the tool's pressure. The sound reminded me of thunder before a storm. Controlled. Inevitable. I watched each line appear, each curve forming into permanence. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes. I stood there until he finished, the scent of heated brass sharp in the air. When he placed the polished plate in my hands, it gleamed. Simple, undeniable, and heavier than it looked. Driving back through the live oaks, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. Not triumph. Something colder, quieter. The kind of calm that comes when truth is finally given shape. At home, Madison was in the foyer arranging flowers for her photo backdrop. "Oh, Eleanor, I meant to tell you. Make sure your wing stays tidy for the guests. We'll have people touring the main house, but we want to keep things separate." "Of course," I said. "Boundaries are important." She didn't notice the small velvet box I carried as I walked past her, up the stairs and down the hall toward my old door. The new nameplate bearing her name still caught the light, arrogant as ever. I traced it lightly with my fingertip, then slipped the velvet box into my pocket and whispered, almost to the brass itself, "Enjoy your moment." Because soon enough, the world would read a different name. The night before the gala, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Every hallway shimmered with quiet anticipation, the kind that comes before either celebration or reckoning. The floral arrangements were in place, the silver polished, the floors gleaming so bright you could see your regrets reflected in them. Madison had gone to the salon in town with her entourage, chasing perfection one layer of gloss at a time. Luke had retreated to his study under the excuse of last-minute emails. The staff moved softly, as if they too sensed something delicate and dangerous in the air. I took my time walking the hallways, the way I used to when Richard was alive and the house hummed with gentler sounds, his radio, the faint clink of his coffee spoon against porcelain. My fingertips brushed the frames of the portraits that lined the walls, Richard in his robe of office, Luke as a boy, gap-toothed and sunburned. My parents on the front steps, proud and young and unknowing. The oil paint beneath my touch was cool, the varnish smooth. Every face on those walls seemed to be watching, waiting. When I reached the landing, a small voice broke the silence behind me. "Grandma?" I turned. Chloe stood there in her nightgown, a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, her hair a halo of sleep-tangled curls. "What are you doing awake, sweetheart?" I asked, softening. I couldn't sleep. Mommy and Daddy were talking about the party. She frowned. "Mommy said it's her house now, but isn't it yours?" Her question was so simple it might have undone a weaker woman. I knelt so we were eye to eye, the hem of my dress brushing the polished floor. "Because some people," I said gently, "mistake permission for ownership." Chloe's brows knit together, trying to understand. "So she's wrong?" "She's learning," I said, "and tomorrow, she'll understand." Chloe nodded, though confusion still flickered behind her sleepy eyes. "Will there be cake?" "There's always cake at endings," I said, and kissed her forehead. "Now go back to bed. Big days need rest." She smiled, the kind that only children can manage in the presence of secrets they don't need to carry, and padded away down the corridor. I waited until her door closed before turning toward the main suite. The chandelier's reflection danced across the hall, casting gold light on the doorplate that bore Madison's name. I opened my palm and looked at the small velvet box resting there, the new plate gleaming quietly inside. The metal caught the light like a promise. A soft knock came at the side entrance. I didn't need to ask who it was. Henry stepped in, rain still beating on his coat. "All quiet on the southern front?" he asked wryly. "As quiet as vanity allows," I said. He set his briefcase on the side table. "You're sure you want it done tonight?" "I want it done before dawn," I said, handing him the velvet box. "By the time her guests arrive, the name on that door will tell the truth." He opened it, studied the engraving, and smiled. "Beautiful work." "It should be," I said. "Names carry weight." Henry's eyes softened with something like admiration or pity, I couldn't tell. "You really are your husband's match, Ellie." I shrugged. "He always said justice. Doesn't shout. It arrives on schedule." As he left, Annie appeared from the parlor, a bottle of champagne in hand, her scarf crooked, her grin conspiratorial. "I brought provisions for courage," she said. "I don't need courage," I replied. "Just patience." Annie popped the cork anyway, the sound echoing down the hallway like a gunshot muffled by velvet. "Tomorrow," she said, pouring 2 glasses. "Justice wears pearls." I took my glass, the bubbles catching the chandelier light. "And a smile," I said, clinking hers gently. We stood there a long moment, the house around us quiet and waiting. The scent of lilies drifted from upstairs, heavy and overripe. Outside, thunder rumbled over the marshes, low and deliberate. I glanced up toward the grand staircase where the golden glow of Madison's chandelier spilled onto the landing. It shimmered over her doorplate, Madison Whitman, owner. I took one last look at it and whispered, "For now." When the clock struck midnight, Henry's car headlights flashed briefly across the drive. He was right on time, and as I watched him disappear up the stairs with the velvet box in hand, a stillness settled inside me. Something like peace, something like preparation. Because by morning, the house would finally remember its name. Saturday morning dawned clear and merciless. Charleston's sunlight poured through the windows like judgment, laying bare every polished surface Madison had obsessed over. The estate hummed with movement. Caterers in crisp white uniforms, florists carrying arrangements the size of pride, valet attendants in navy jackets rehearsing deference. From the guest wing, I watched it all unfold through lace curtains. A parade of silk dresses and tailored suits began to spill out of sleek cars onto the circular drive. The air smelled of magnolia, perfume, and the faint electricity of social ambition. The party had begun. By 10, the main doors swung open for the first guests. Laughter and perfume rushed in like a tide. Madison descended the grand staircase in a gown of pale champagne silk, her hair sculpted into impossible perfection. The chandelier light scattered over her like applause. She paused halfway down the stairs for the photographer, chin tilted, smile poised, the image of effortless control. "Welcome, welcome," she sang out. "We're so thrilled you could join us in our home." Every syllable was coded in performance. Cameras clicked. Guests murmured admiration. I stood by the doorway, greeting people I'd known for decades. Neighbors, judges' wives, and society women who pretended not to notice which side of the room I stood on. "Eleanor!" one of them gasped, clutching my hand. "You look lovely. Isn't it strange seeing the house so refreshed?" I smiled. "Houses remember who loved them? Paint doesn't change that." She blinked, unsure whether to laugh. I rescued her from the decision by moving on. Annie appeared beside me, looking elegant in navy and pearls, her eyes sharp as polished glass. "My God," she whispered. "This place looks like Versailles, if Versailles had Wi-Fi." I hid a smile. Every queen decorates her downfall. Madison's laughter floated from the center of the crowd. "Please, help yourselves to mimosas. We have the most gorgeous view from the master suite. You must see the transformation." Gossip rippled through the guests like wind through reeds. I heard she completely redid the old bedroom. Can you imagine the nerve? Still, she's stunning, isn't she? Luke hovered near the champagne table, his smile too bright, his laugh too quick. Every so often, his eyes found mine across the room, hesitant, guilty, maybe even pleading. I offered him nothing. Weak men don't need sympathy. They need silence long enough to hear themselves think. Henry mingled near the back, quiet and watchful, a single glass of sparkling water in hand. He caught my eye and nodded once, subtle as a signature. The plate had been installed. The crowd swelled toward the staircase again as Madison called for attention. "We'll start the house tour upstairs in just a moment," she announced, her voice gleaming. "But first, A toast to new beginnings and fresh energy in these beautiful old walls. I lifted my glass, not to her, but to the memory of Richard, who would have enjoyed the theater of it all. Beside me, Annie leaned closer. "Everyone loves a queen," she murmured, "until the crown shifts." "Then," I said softly, "they remember who built the throne." Madison's toast went on. Gratitude, vision, something about legacy. But I barely heard her. My attention was on the staircase, the polished banister that had guided generations, the brass nameplate above the master suite door gleaming just out of view. Guests were already murmuring about the upcoming reveal. The air thickened with curiosity, envy, and the faint thrill of gossip in bloom. Cameras waited. Madison gestured toward Luke. "Darling, will you join me upstairs?" He hesitated only a heartbeat before following, his hand brushing the rail like a man climbing into a spotlight he didn't ask for. The guests began to trail after them, laughter spilling across the landing. I stayed behind with Annie and Henry, watching the procession ascend. Annie nudged my arm. "Are you sure?" she whispered. I took a slow sip of champagne. "Timing," I said. "Always timing." From above came the sound of Madison's bright, untroubled voice. "And now, everyone, welcome to our masterpiece." Her words echoed down the grand staircase, light and proud. And though she couldn't see me from where she stood, I smiled, small, deliberate, unhurried, because the house, at last, was ready to speak. The crowd followed Madison up the grand staircase like pilgrims in designer shoes, their laughter echoing off the marble. Cameras clicked in bursts, champagne. Glasses clinked, and the air thickened with perfume and expectation. Madison turned at the top landing, radiant and breathless under the chandelier. "Come, everyone," she said, waving them forward. "You have to see our new suite." She swung the double doors wide. The guests surged behind her, charmed, curious, complicit. The newly gilded walls gleamed in the morning light. The chandelier blazed overhead like captured sunlight, scattering gold across every surface. "Oh, it's exquisite," someone gasped. "You'd never know this used to be—" Another began, stopping short when they remembered whose room it had been. Madison laughed, airy and dismissive. "Oh, don't be silly. It's just a room. What matters is how you make it yours." Photographers moved in closer, lenses catching every gleam of brass, crystal, and hubris. Madison posed at the vanity, tilting her head just so. Luke stood by the window, jaw tight, smile brittle. Annie and I lingered in the hall below, listening to the applause of false admiration floating down the staircase like feathers from a dying bird. Then came the sound, small, sharp, human, a gasp. Madison?" The silence that followed carried its own gravity. Conversations froze mid-laugh, champagne flutes paused mid-air. "What?" Madison said, her smile faltering for the first time. Someone near the door pointed upward. Your nameplate." Madison turned slowly, confusion hardening into dread. Above the doorway, polished and proud, the brass plate gleamed under the chandelier's light. "Eleanor M. Whitman, owner, Whitman Estate." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the whispers began. "Wait, what does that mean? I thought, wasn't this her house?" "Owner?" Madison stared, color draining from her face. That must be a mistake." She laughed, a brittle, tinny sound that clattered against the silence. "The engravers someone must have." Henry stepped forward from the back of the group, his calm presence slicing cleanly through the chaos. "No mistake," he said, voice steady as law itself. "The estate trust remains under Mrs. Whitman's sole ownership. It always has." Every head turned toward him. Cameras forgot to click. Even the chandelier seemed to quiet itself, the crystals trembling faintly in the still air. Madison blinked rapidly. What are you talking about, Luke? Tell them. Luke's mouth opened, then closed. He looked from his wife to his mother, and in that moment his silence said everything. I stepped forward then, unhurried, each step measured against the rhythm of my heartbeat. The guests parted instinctively, their curiosity bending toward me like flowers seeking the sun. Welcome, I said, my voice low but clear enough to carry. To my room. The words landed softly, but they resonated through the air like a struck bell. Madison's lips parted, but no sound came. Ellie, one of the older guests, stammered. We didn't realize. You weren't meant to, I said gently, but truth tends to arrive fashionably late. Henry glanced toward me, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction behind his professional calm. The trust clause is very specific, he told the crowd. Any commercial or personal exploitation of the estate constitutes immediate reversion of control to the trustee. Mrs. Whitman, he nodded toward me, has merely exercised what was always her legal right. A murmur spread through the room, equal parts awe and discomfort. Madison stood frozen, her hands trembling around a glass she hadn't realized she was still holding. It slipped, shattered against the hardwood. You planned this, she hissed. No, I said. You performed this. I simply gave you an audience. Annie appeared in the doorway then, her expression a perfect cocktail of pride and amusement. Well, she said to no one in particular, every queen eventually learns who built her castle. Laughter, real this time, broke from somewhere in the back of the room, small and nervous but irrepressible. Madison turned toward it, eyes wild. This is my home, she snapped. Luke, tell them. Luke looked at her for a long, excruciating moment. Then he said quietly, It was never ours, Madison. You just forgot whose name was on the door. Her breath caught, ragged. The silence that followed wasn't pity. It was realization. I took one last look around the room, at the faces, the cameras, the gold that no longer glittered but glared. Then I smiled, not cruelly but with the peace of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. Enjoy the party, I said, turning toward the door. I believe the house just made its introduction. As I descended the stairs, applause began. Not loud, not mocking, but the slow, stunned kind that follows truth laid bare. The kind that doesn't stop even when you leave the room. The applause faded into whispers before I even reached the last stair. Behind me, the echo of Madison's humiliation hung in the air like perfume that refused to dissipate. Sweet, heavy, and unmistakably artificial. Guests began to trickle down the staircase in uneasy clusters, their polite chatter thinly veiling the thrill of witnessing a fall. Such a scene. One woman murmured behind her hand. Did you see her face? Another whispered, unable to hide the fascination. Charleston's finest would feast on this for weeks. Annie joined me in the foyer, her expression caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. Well, she said softly, that was a sermon in silence. I didn't answer. I was watching the top of the staircase. Madison stood there still, frozen in disbelief, her champagne gown glimmering dully under the chandelier that had lost its warmth. Luke hovered beside her, torn between the ruin he'd enabled and the truth that had just walked out of the room. When she finally moved, it was sudden. A brittle, snapping motion, as if vanity itself had cracked. How could you do this? She spat, voice trembling. In front of everyone? Luke descended first, hurrying toward me. Mother, he said, his voice low but taut. You embarrassed her. I met his eyes evenly. She did that herself. He flinched but didn't look away. You could have handled this privately. Privacy, I said, is a privilege of the respectful. He hesitated, guilt flushing his face. You always think you're right. No, I said. I just wait until the truth catches up. Behind him, Madison came storming down the stairs, every click of her heels a declaration of wounded pride. Her face was a mask, flawless makeup failing to hide the tears breaking through. A photographer, perhaps forgetting himself, raised his camera. The flash caught her mid-step, anger, disbelief, and humiliation immortalized in a single burst of light. She rounded on him instantly. "Delete that!" But the damage was already done. The image would travel faster than her denial ever could. Madison pushed through the murmuring crowd, her voice cutting through their whispers. "All of you, out! The party's over!" No one moved. Guests exchanged looks, uncertain whom to obey. After all, the door now bore someone else's name. Henry stepped forward then, steady and unflappable. "I suggest we all give Mrs. Whitman." He glanced at me. A moment of quiet. Madison turned on him. "You think this is over? You think I'll let her—" "Madison," I said calmly, "the house isn't yours to let." Her eyes flared bright and wild. "You're cruel," she whispered. "You've humiliated me in front of everyone I know." I shook my head. "You humiliated yourself by mistaking inheritance for invitation." For a moment the fight left her completely. She looked around the room, at the faces that once adored her, and now watched her, as one might study a candle guttering in its final moments. Luke tried to reach for her arm, but she pulled away. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "You let her do this." Then she was gone, storming out the front doors into the crisp sunlight, the photographers on the lawn turning instinctively as the doors burst open. The cameras clicked again, faster this time, relentless. Madison covered her face with one trembling hand, but the damage had already spread beyond the frame. Annie exhaled beside me, shaking her head slowly. "You didn't raise your voice once." I set my empty glass on the sideboard. Volume never equals power. Henry approached quietly, his briefcase tucked under his arm. The crowd had begun to thin, their whispers trailing toward the door. He waited until the last guest left before speaking. "It's done," he said simply. He opened the briefcase and drew out a crisp folder, its seal unbroken. "Your husband foresaw everything. The clause activated the moment she used the estate for publicity. I've already filed the notice." He handed me the papers, the official reinstatement documents. The estate, fully, legally, publicly, mine once more. The gold seal caught the late afternoon light, and for a moment, I saw Richard's handwriting in memory beside it. His words echoed softly. "The law protects those who remember who they are." Annie raised her glass again, this time half empty, forgotten. "So what now?" she asked. I looked toward the front door, where the sunlight still spilled through the glass like truth, finding its way home. "Now," I said, "we let the silence finish what pride started." Outside, a final camera flash lit the drive. Inside, the house exhaled. By Monday morning, the humiliation had gone digital. Charleston's social pages, gossip columns, even national lifestyle blogs, all carried the same headline in slightly different tones of awe and cruelty. Society influencer Madison Whitman loses home mid-gala. Photos accompanied every post, Madison frozen mid-step on the grand staircase, shock etched under a layer of highlighter and powder. Another showed her fleeing through the front doors, face half hidden behind trembling fingers. Her own social media was worse. Thousands of comments under her last house transformation post, claiming what wasn't hers. Yikes. Maybe don't build your brand on someone else's deed. Poetic justice served cold. Sponsors began issuing statements before the day was out. "We have discontinued our partnership with Ms. Whitman. We wish her the best in future endeavors." Corporate mercy, wrapped in polite distance. By Tuesday, her once bustling blog had gone silent. The photos of the new master suite disappeared overnight, but screenshots travel faster than regret. The internet had claimed her downfall and turned it into content. I didn't gloat. I simply read the news quietly over breakfast, stirring sugar into my coffee. From the terrace, I could see Luke walking along the garden path, phone in hand, posture bent with the weight of realization. When he finally came inside, he looked older than his years, creased, subdued, stripped of pretense. "They're tearing her apart," he said softly. "Online. Everywhere." I folded the paper and set it aside. "The truth doesn't tear, Luke. It reveals." He sank into the chair across from me, eyes rimmed red. "You warned me," he said after a long silence. "All those times you said she was more concerned with perception than foundation. I didn't want to hear it." "Because you loved her," I said gently. "And love is a poor judge of character." He gave a bitter laugh. "You should have stopped her." "I tried," I said. "But trying doesn't work on people who only listen to applause." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I forgot who built this place, Mom. Who kept it alive after Dad died. I let her talk about it like it was hers because it was easier than correcting her." His honesty was small, but real. The kind that costs more than it seems. I reached for the ledger on the table, its pages heavy with records, receipts, proof. I closed it gently. "Now remember who can rebuild it." He looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "The estate," I said. "It needs someone to manage its affairs." "Henry agrees. It should stay in the family." He frowned. "You mean me?" "Under my supervision," I clarified. "We'll start by undoing the damage, financial, structural, reputational. You'll learn the way your father did, by earning the right to care for what you inherit." He nodded, quiet but resolute. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," I said. "And Luke, don't apologize for being blind. Just keep your eyes open now." Outside, the marsh wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant thunder, the kind that stays on the horizon, threatening but cleansing. Later that afternoon, Annie stopped by with her usual lack of ceremony, letting herself in through the kitchen door. She found me in the study, reviewing restoration plans with Henry. "Well," she said, setting her purse on the table, "the internet has done your work for you. I just saw a meme of Madison's face next to a foreclosure sign. The comments section is biblical." Henry didn't look up. "Public humiliation isn't justice," he murmured, "but it's often the prelude to it." Annie grinned. "Still, I'd call it satisfying." I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. Satisfaction fades, legacy endures. Annie studied me for a long moment, her expression softening. "You're not gloating. You're restoring balance." "Balance doesn't require noise," I said. "Only steadiness." She smiled. "Mercy after victory. That's class." I met her gaze, my tone quiet but certain. "Mercy isn't for them, Annie. It's for the house. It deserves peace after so much vanity." Henry closed his briefcase with a click. "Well said, Mrs. Whitman." As evening settled, Luke joined us in the doorway, sleeves rolled, shoulders squared. He looked ready, not triumphant, not broken, but humbled into purpose. Outside, the oaks swayed gently, their leaves whispering against the walls that had witnessed it all. The Whitman estate stood steady again, restored, reclaimed, and unbothered by noise. But as I looked through the tall windows, I saw Madison's abandoned car still sitting at the edge of the drive, gleaming faintly under the setting sun. A reminder. Victory isn't always clean. Sometimes it leaves traces. I turned away from the window and said quietly, "Tomorrow, we begin again." 3 days passed before I saw Madison again. The air had softened after the storm. Low light over the marshes, the scent of rain still clinging to the earth. I was in the study, reviewing repair bids with Henry, when the doorbell rang. Annie, who had stopped by under the pretense of moral support, peeked out the window and arched a brow. "Well," she murmured, Look what the tide dragged back. Madison stood on the front steps, her hair undone, her clothes plain and uncalculated. No camera flashes, no entourage. Just a woman who'd run out of versions of herself to perform. I told Henry to take a break, and he nodded, slipping out quietly. Annie lingered at the doorway but didn't leave. She knew the kind of silence that required witnesses. Madison hesitated before stepping inside. Her eyes were red, her voice stripped of polish. "I went too far," she said. I studied her for a long moment. The woman before me was not the glittering hostess who had laughed under chandeliers. This one spoke softly, her pride cracked and leaking something that almost resembled humility. "Yes," I said finally. "You did. But distance can be useful." She nodded, tears trembling but refusing to fall. "I deserve everything people are saying about me." "I don't know about that," I said, walking toward the window. "The world exaggerates both praise and punishment. What matters is what you do after the echo fades." She clasped her hands tightly. "I came to ask if Chloe and I could stay, just until things settle, for her stability." There it was. The plea. The unguarded one. Not entitlement now, but fear. I turned back to her, the quiet in the room deepening. "You're not wrong about stability. Children need roots, not moving trucks." Her voice cracked. Then you'll let us?" "I'll let you," I said. "But not in the way you think." Annie tilted her head, curious. I gestured toward the staircase. "The grand suite will no longer be a bedroom. I've decided to turn it into a community art room, in Richard's honor. He always believed education was the true heirloom of any home." Madison blinked. "You're converting it?" "Yes. The foundation will fund classes for local children, painting, design, architecture. The room will belong to purpose now, not pride." For a moment, her face betrayed everything she didn't say. Disbelief, resentment, sorrow. But then, unexpectedly, something softer broke through. Relief. "Maybe that's better," she whispered. "For Chloe. For everyone." I nodded. "You may stay here while she attends school. The guest rooms are comfortable enough." Her mouth trembled around the word guest, but she didn't argue. "Thank you," she said. "I don't deserve this." "No," I said gently. "But grace isn't about deserving." She drew a shaky breath and looked around the foyer, the same space where she had once rehearsed her dominance. "It's strange," she said, voice small. "I used to think this house made me important." "It doesn't make anyone important," I said. "It only reflects what you bring to it." Madison nodded, wiping her eyes. "Then I'd like to bring something better this time." "Good," I said. "Start with silence. It's cleansing." She managed the faintest smile, then turned to leave, her footsteps slow and unsteady but no longer performative. When the door closed behind her, Annie exhaled the breath she'd been holding. "Well," she said, "poetic justice with paintbrushes." I smiled. "Justice restores, revenge ruins. I prefer the former." Annie poured herself a finger of sherry and sat on the edge of the desk. "You realize, of course, that every woman in Charleston will try to donate to this art room now. Guilt is fashionable." "Let them," I said. "Legacy has room for everyone." Through the window, I watched Madison cross the garden toward the guest wing. Smaller, humbler, appropriate. Chloe ran out from the side yard, her laughter bright against the stillness. She took her mother's hand without hesitation. That small gesture, uncomplicated love, was what I had chosen to protect all along. The wind shifted, stirring the curtains. I looked up toward the landing where the brass nameplate still gleamed in quiet defiance of ego and time. Eleanor M. Whitman, owner, Whitman Estate. I touched the edge of my teacup and said softly, Some lessons require a home to teach them. Outside, sunlight pooled across the steps like forgiveness finding its shape. By the time autumn settled over Charleston, the estate had grown quieter, its energy transformed from spectacle to sanctuary. The air smelled of linseed oil and turpentine now, the sense of creation replacing the perfume of performance. Children's laughter drifted from the grand suite, the art room, as their brushes swept color across canvas where pride once hung like drapery. It was on one of those golden afternoons that Henry arrived again. He stood in the doorway of the study, a man carrying both habit and history in equal measure. "Ellie," he said, "I've found something." I looked up from the paperwork spread across my desk. Donation forms, lesson schedules, balance sheets. "You've already given me enough discoveries to last a lifetime." "This one," he said, holding a slim folder, "wasn't mine to give until now. It's the final addendum from Richard's trust. I thought it was a duplicate clause. I was wrong." He handed me the document, and I saw my husband's handwriting, strong, deliberate, still capable of cutting through time. At the top, in bold ink, "Provision for preservation and legacy." I read aloud, "If, at any point, the estate or its owner suffers disrespect, negligence, or misuse of honor, the trustee may, at her sole discretion, transfer ownership of the property to the Whitman Heritage Foundation, a charitable trust ensuring perpetual preservation for the public good. All heirs may reside therein only as caretakers, never as owners." I traced the signature at the bottom, my throat tightening. He planned for even this. Henry nodded. "He knew you'd protect the house, Ellie, but he also knew you'd protect people who might not deserve it." I closed the folder slowly. "Then it's time." He tilted his head. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since the day Madison hung her name where mine belonged." By evening, the paperwork was complete. My signature joined Richard's across the page, ink meeting ink like two ends of a promise finally closed. When the others gathered in the parlor, Luke, Madison, Chloe, and Annie, the light outside had turned the oak's copper. Henry stood beside the fireplace, the official documents resting on the mantel like judgment wrapped in formality. Luke spoke first, his voice steady but subdued. "You wanted to see us?" "Yes," I said. "It's time we define what this house will be." Madison shifted uneasily. "You've already done that. The art room, the classes. Everyone in town is talking about it." "This goes further," I said. "Richard left a final provision in the trust, one last measure of preservation." Henry cleared his throat and began reading aloud. His voice carried through the room like a gavel wrapped in velvet. When he reached the phrase, "may reside therein only as caretakers, never as owners," Madison's breath caught audibly. She stared at me, color draining from her face. "So this means—" "What? That no one in this family will ever own it again?" "That's correct," I said calmly. "Ownership isn't a prize, it's a responsibility. And this family has already proven how poorly pride handles property." Luke swallowed hard, his eyes falling to the floor. "You're right," he said quietly. "And maybe that's what we need. Structure. Something bigger than any of us." Madison turned to him, almost pleading. "Luke, you can't just—" He raised a hand. "No, Madison. Mom's right. We nearly lost everything trying to turn legacy into lifestyle. Maybe it's time we learn how to live within something sacred instead of trying to own it." Chloe, perched on the rug with a sketch pad on her knees, looked up with wide eyes. "So, Grandma," she said, "does that mean the house belongs to everyone now?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, everyone who respects it." Annie's voice, warm but edged with awe, filled the quiet. "And to you," through her example. I met Chloe's gaze. "Some walls protect," I said softly. "Some teach. This one will do both." Madison turned toward the window, arms folded tightly, her reflection fractured in the glass. For once, she didn't argue. Maybe she finally understood that permanence has nothing to do with possession. Outside, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the art room upstairs, new voices filling old air. Henry closed the folder and handed it to me. "It's done," he said. "The Whitman Estate is now a foundation, forever preserved." The weight that had sat on my shoulders for decades lifted, leaving something gentler in its place. "Good," I said. "Then maybe now it can breathe again." As dusk deepened, I looked toward the staircase, its rail polished smooth by generations of hands, and thought of Richard. "Some legacies," I whispered, "are only complete when shared." Spring arrived with the kind of warmth that forgives winter without forgetting it. The Whitman estate no longer felt like a battleground, it felt alive again. Mornings were filled with sound, brushes tapping against jars, children's voices tumbling through the corridors, piano notes floating faintly from the parlor. The grand suite, once Madison's showroom of vanity, now carried the scent of paint and possibility. Easels stood where her velvet chaise had been. Sunlight streamed across watercolor palettes instead of mirrored dressers. The walls, scrubbed of their gold sheen, were washed in soft cream, a color that let creation speak louder than decoration. I stood in the doorway one morning, watching a dozen children, barefoot, laughing, unself-conscious, painting landscapes of the marshland beyond the estate. Chloe sat among them, brow furrowed in concentration, her small hands smudged with blue and green. At the far table, Madison arranged paintbrushes into jars. Her movements were careful now, measured. The pride that once defined her had thinned into something quieter. Purpose, maybe even grace. She wore linen instead of silk, her hair tied simply at her neck. "2 more families confirmed for the next session," she told me softly. "I thought we could extend the program through summer." I nodded. "That's a good idea." She hesitated. "Do you ever regret it? Turning the estate into the foundation?" I smiled faintly. "You only regret what you lose when you mistake it for what you own. I didn't lose anything. I just gave it air to breathe." Her eyes softened with understanding, or maybe envy of peace she hadn't found yet. "I'm learning," she said. "You are," I replied. "Slowly. That's the only way learning works." From the corridor, Luke appeared, clipboard in hand, tie loosened from a morning of meetings. "Mom," he said, "the financials look good. We can cover expansion through the heritage grants without touching reserves." "Good," I said. "Your father would be proud." He smiled, an honest, unguarded one. "He taught me structure. You taught me stewardship." "That was the lesson," I said quietly. "Not everything you inherit should be measured in square footage." Later that afternoon, I stood before a small gathering in the East Garden, reporters, donors, townspeople who had once only seen the estate from the road. The Whitman Foundation was hosting its first public exhibition, a collection of the children's art inspired by the property. Henry introduced me, his voice warm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman will now speak on what she calls inheritance of grace." I took the podium, the magnolia blossoms trembling slightly in the breeze. "When my husband built this house," I began, "he believed legacy was not about possession, but participation. These walls have heard laughter and conflict, triumph and correction. Today, they listen to something new: creation." The crowd was quiet, leaning in. "Inheritance," I continued, "isn't the transfer of things. It's the transfer of understanding. And grace, well, grace is what keeps us human while we learn." Applause came soft but sincere. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. One headline would later read, "A rebirth of legacy at the Whitman Estate." After the speeches, Annie joined me under the pergola with 2 glasses of lemonade. "You realize," she said, "you've done something impossible. You turned revenge into architecture." I laughed softly, the sound carrying over the garden. "No," I said, "into education." She raised her glass. "Either way, it's permanent." I watched Chloe across the lawn, crouched beside the steps, her watercolor set spread open. She was painting the brass nameplate, the one that gleamed at the front door, burnished by sunlight and time. When she finished, she ran to me, holding up the paper proudly. "Look, Grandma, I painted your name." The plate in her painting shimmered with the uneven strokes of a child's love, the letters slightly tilted but unmistakable. Eleanor M. Whitman, owner, Whitman Estate. I knelt beside her, touched the corner of the page gently. "You did beautifully, darling." Chloe grinned. "It's for everyone to see." "Yes," I said, meeting her bright, certain eyes. "That's exactly the point." As the sun dipped lower, golden light spilled through the oaks, warming the facade of the house that had finally found peace in purpose. Inside, laughter echoed against restored walls. Outside, the brass plate gleamed, unchanged, but understood. And somewhere beyond the horizon, I could almost hear Richard's voice again. "Some homes stand not for those who live in them, but for what they teach when we finally learn how to listen." Evening settled slowly over the Whitman estate, the kind of evening that felt earned. The corridors glowed with the last threads of sunlight, stretching long and golden across the polished floors. From somewhere distant came the hum of children cleaning brushes, the faint clatter of chairs being stacked for tomorrow's class, and laughter, the kind that fills spaces without asking permission. I moved through the quiet hall, each step echoing softly against wood that had outlasted every voice that tried to claim it. The air carried that gentle scent of turpentine and old cedar, memory and renewal mingling in perfect measure. At the end of the corridor, the brass nameplate gleamed beneath a pool of amber light. Eleanor M. Whitman, owner, Whitman Estate. I traced the letters with the tip of my finger. The metal was warm from the day's sun, the engraving deep and sure. It had survived storms, vanity, and silence alike. "Still mine," I whispered, "but shared with those who respect it." The house seemed to breathe with me, wood expanding, air settling, as if in quiet agreement. From the parlor drifted the sound of Annie's laughter mingling with a few lingering guests from the art program. She was telling a story, something about Henry being mistaken for a painter earlier that morning. Her voice carried the kind of mirth that only peace makes possible. Then came the rush of footsteps. Small, light, familiar. "Grandma!" Chloe darted into the hallway, ribbons loose in her hair, a smear of paint on her cheek. She ran straight into me, nearly knocking the ledger from my hand. "Everyone loves your room," she said breathlessly. "They said it's the prettiest place in the whole house." I smiled, smoothing a streak of cobalt from her forehead. "That's because it finally has the right name on the door." She looked up at the nameplate, her smile wide and proud. "It's like magic," she said. "Your name makes people feel safe." I bent down so we were eye to eye. "Names don't make people safe, sweetheart. What you do with them does." She nodded solemnly, as if filing the lesson away for later, and then bounded down the corridor again, her laughter echoing off the walls. From the doorway of the parlor, Annie appeared, glass in hand, her pearls catching the light like punctuation. "Well," she called, "to grace that owns itself." I raised my glass of sherry in silent agreement. "And to houses that remember their purpose." She grinned. "You mean houses that remember their owner?" I laughed quietly. "Not owner. Steward. There's a difference." The conversation faded back into the parlor where the warmth of company spread like candlelight. I lingered by the door a moment longer, listening to the mingled sounds of Chloe's laughter, the clink of glasses, and the faint whisper of the evening wind brushing through the magnolias outside. The brass plate gleamed again, catching the last orange flicker of dusk before the sun disappeared beyond the marsh. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to guard it. The house didn't need defense anymore. It had memory. I pressed my palm flat against the cool wood beneath the plate, feeling the heartbeat of the home thrum faintly through it. In that rhythm, I could still hear Richard, his patience, his measured voice, his faith in time to do its work. Behind me, Annie's toast carried faintly again, "To grace that owns itself," and I answered under my breath, "And to truth that remembers its name." The lamps flickered to life one by one, their glow soft against the hall's long shadows. I turned away from the door at last, my reflection lingering in the brass as I moved. An older woman, steady, unafraid, still learning the rhythm of letting go. As I reached the end of the corridor, I glanced back once more at the door and smiled. She laughed and said it was hers, until truth reminded her who built the room she stood in.